It began on a quiet, dusty morning in a small, forgotten town called Angel's Camp, a place that sat somewhere between the past and a dream. The sun had barely risen above the hills, and a light fog rested on the streets like an old memory that refused to fade. A traveler, new to this part of California, made his way down the uneven road toward the local tavern. A place that looked like it had seen 1,000 stories and refused to let any of them go. His name was Samuel Wheeler, a man of manners and curiosity. He had been told that somewhere in this town lived a man named Simon Wheeler, who knew an odd story about someone called Jim Smiley. When Samuel entered the tavern, the smell of tobacco and sawdust filled the air. Men sat at rough wooden tables, their faces weathered from the sun and years of mining dust. Behind the counter, an old man sat half asleep, half awake. His chair tilted back against the wall, his face lost in thought. That was Simon Wheeler. "Morning," Samuel said quietly. "I was told you might know a man named Jim Smiley?" The old man opened one eye, slow and deliberate, like he wasn't sure whether the voice belonged to the present or to a dream. Then he smiled, that lazy, unbothered kind of smile that only people who've seen too much can wear. "Jim Smiley?" he repeated, his voice like dry wind moving through the saloon. "Well now, I reckon I do." He straightened his chair, leaned forward and began to speak. Not fast, not slow, but with that particular rhythm that only great storytellers seem to have. And as he spoke, the whole tavern seemed to fade away, as if time itself had decided to sit down and listen. The legend of Jim Smiley. "Now, this here Jim Smiley," Simon began, "was the curiousest man that ever lived. Curious in ways you don't often see. He'd bet on anything. Didn't matter what. If there was even a shadow of a chance to gamble, Jim was your man." Simon's eyes gleamed a little as he spoke, and Samuel leaned in. He'd bet on horse races, dog fights, chicken fights, even on how long it'd take a preacher to start preaching. Once, he even bet on which of two birds would fly off a fence first. The old man chuckled. And it wasn't just about money. Jim loved the game, the thrill of not knowing, of pushing his luck, of proving he could see what others couldn't. Simon took a long pause, his voice softening. "But the thing about men like Jim is, they never know when to stop." He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the door, as though expecting Jim to walk in right then, covered in dust, grinning from ear to ear. "One day," he said, "Jim Smiley came across a frog named Daniel Webster. It was early morning when Jim found him, a small green frog sitting on the edge of a pond near the mining camp. Most men wouldn't have given it a second glance. But Jim wasn't most men. He picked it up, turned it over, and grinned. 'Now there,' he said, 'is a frog with potential.' He took the frog home, built it a box, and named it Daniel Webster, after a great orator he'd once heard of. And from that day on, Jim started training the frog. For months, he fed it the best bugs he could find. He'd place it on a little table, tap behind it with his finger, and watch it jump. Each day, it jumped higher, stronger, faster. By the end of the season, that frog could leap clean over a fence post. And Jim, well, he was proud. 'By thunder,' he'd say to anyone who'd listen, 'there ain't a frog in Calaveras County can outjump Daniel Webster.' He carried that frog everywhere. If a stranger walked into town, Jim would be the first to greet him. Not with a handshake, but with a challenge. 'Care for a little wager?' he'd ask, his grin sharp as a coin's edge. And more often than not, they'd take him up on it. It became a kind of legend around Angel's Camp. The man with the frog that couldn't lose. The stranger. One afternoon, when the sky hung heavy with the color of rain, a stranger rode into town. He was quiet, clean, and had that calm look of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He stopped at the tavern, tied his horse outside, and walked in. Jim Smiley was already there, bragging to anyone who'd listen about Daniel Webster's latest victory. The frog sat in his box on the counter, blinking lazily as if he knew the attention was all his. The stranger leaned against the bar and said, "You mean to tell me that frog of yours can really jump higher than any other?" Jim grinned. "You better believe it, friend." The man tilted his head. "Well now, I don't see anything special about him. Looks just like any ordinary frog to me." Jim chuckled. "That's what they all say before they lose their money." The stranger smiled faintly. "I ain't much of a betting man," he said, "but I'll try my luck once, just for the fun of it." Jim's eyes lit up. "Now that's what I like to hear. You got a frog?" The stranger shook his head. "No, I don't." Jim thought for a moment. "Well, I'll tell you what. You hold Daniel Webster while I go down to the swamp and catch you a frog. Shouldn't take me more than 10 minutes. "Fair enough," said the stranger, picking up the box. Jim grabbed his hat and hurried out the door, disappearing down the road. The trick. The tavern grew quiet after Jim left. The stranger looked around, made sure no one was watching, then set the box on the counter. He opened it slowly and peered inside. The frog blinked back at him, calm and innocent. The stranger smirked, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a handful of small lead bullets, the kind used in rifle cartridges. He lifted Daniel Webster gently, pried open his mouth, and one by one, dropped the bullets inside. When he was done, the frog was heavier than a stone. The stranger wiped his hands, closed the box, and waited. The stranger nodded. "All right then, let's make it fair. $20 to the man whose frog jumps highest." Jim agreed without hesitation. They set the frogs on the floor. The tavern crowd gathered around, grinning in anticipation. Jim gave the signal. The stranger's frog leapt. A clean, graceful jump that landed halfway across the room. Daniel Webster didn't move. He just sat there, still and heavy, staring straight ahead like he'd suddenly forgotten what jumping was. The laughter erupted. Jim stared, wide-eyed. He tapped behind Daniel, nothing. He nudged him, still nothing. The stranger shrugged, pocketed his winnings, and said, "Well, I guess that's that. Pleasure doing business with you." He walked out the door, his boots echoing across the wooden floor, his smile hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Jim knelt down, confused. "Daniel," he muttered, "what in tarnation's wrong with you?" He picked up the frog and nearly dropped him. "He weighs a ton," Jim gasped. He opened the frog's mouth, and out poured the tiny lead bullets, clinking onto the floor like coins spilling from a broken purse. Jim's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, and without another word, he bolted out the door. The chase. The stranger was halfway down the road when Jim spotted him. Dust rose behind his boots. "Hey!" Jim shouted, running after him. "Come back here, you no-good cheat." The stranger turned once, saw him coming, and laughed. That low, quiet laugh of a man who just played the perfect hand. He didn't stop. Jim chased him through the muddy streets, through the market, past the church, yelling all the way. But by the time he reached the edge of town, the stranger had vanished. Gone with the wind and $20 richer. Breathless, covered in dust, Jim stood alone in the road. He looked down at the frog in his hands and shook his head. "Well, Daniel," he said softly, "I reckon we both got taught a lesson today." The story ends. Back in the tavern, Simon Wheeler stopped talking. The room was quiet again, the light from the window falling across his weathered face. Samuel Wheeler blinked, uncertain if the story was finished or if there was more. "That's it?" he asked finally. Simon nodded. "That's it." Samuel smiled faintly. "So what happened to Jim Smiley after that?" Simon shrugged. "Oh, I reckon he went back to his gambling. Some men can't quit, even after they've been beat." He leaned back, folded his hands, and closed his eyes again, as if the story itself had put him back to rest. Outside, the town carried on. A few horses clopping past, someone laughing down the street. Samuel stood there for a moment longer, then tipped his hat and stepped into the sunlight. The air smelled of dust and iron, of history and regret. He smiled to himself, shaking his head. That man, he whispered, was either a fool or a genius, and maybe, just maybe, a little of both. Epilogue. Years later, people in Angel's Camp still spoke of Jim Smiley and his remarkable frog. Some said the stranger returned one night and left town again just as quickly. Others swore Jim found him in another county and won his money back tenfold. But no one ever really knew the truth. What they did know was this. In that small, dusty corner of California, the story of a gambler and his frog became legend. Told and retold around fires, in saloons, in quiet homes when the rain tapped softly on the roof. And each time someone told it, they added a little more laughter, a little more truth, and a little more heart. Because maybe, in the end, that's what stories are for, not to remind us who won or lost, but to remind us that every fool, every dreamer, and every gambler still believes in one thing. That luck, just once more, might be on their side.